Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going back in time to the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, to India.
Okay.
And we're going to be looking at a pretty radical economic policy experiment,
Uh-huh.
a 97.5% income tax rate.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
it is.
97.5%.
Yeah, wow. So we've got some great sources for this deep dive.
Go ahead.
We've got an article by Gautam Chikermain and a piece from the Times of India.
Oh.
And we're going to kind of try and figure out how this policy came about, like what its goals were, and maybe uncover some surprises along the way.
Thank good.
Yeah. So,
Well, what's really fascinating about this period in India
okay.
is that, like many other nations at the time, they were super influenced by all these socialist ideals.
Right.
So the government, led by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi,
Mm-hmm.
was really focused on redistributing wealth and using all that tax revenue to fuel these big social programs, like massive initiatives, like the Green Revolution.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it was aimed at, boosting agricultural productivity and trying to achieve food security.
So to achieve these goals, they decided to implement a pretty serious income tax rate.
Yes.
And we're not talking just, high. We're talking 97.5% at its peak.
Seriously.
I mean, can you even imagine, only keeping 2.5 rupees
Oh, my gosh.
for every 100 that you earned above a certain income level?
I know. It's just,
Wow.
that's hard to fathom from today's perspective, right?
Right.
You have to remember that even the United States,
Yeah.
which had a 94% rate during World War II,
Wow.
they had lowered it to 70% by the 1970s.
Okay.
So India's rate was truly exceptional,
Right.
even globally,
Yeah.
where higher tax rates were more common back then.
That's a great point. It really puts things in perspective.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the goal was noble, like they wanted to create a more equitable society, but did it actually work?
Well-
Was everybody on board with this idea?
I mean, the idea using taxation as a tool for wealth redistribution was definitely a hot topic globally at the time.
Okay.
And Indira Gandhi, she clearly articulated this in her 1970 budget speech.
Okay.
She stated that taxation is a major instrument in all modern societies to achieve greater equality of incomes and wealth.
That's a powerful statement.
It is.
But whether everyone agreed with her is another question.
Right.
Our sources don't actually get into, specific dissenting voices or anything.
Yeah.
But you can imagine that such a dramatic policy would have definitely sparked debate.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, 97.5% is a huge chunk of your earnings to give up, even if it's for a good cause.
Absolutely.
So what actually happened when this policy went into effect?
Yeah.
Did it bring in all this, expected flood of revenue to fund all those awesome social programs?
Well, that's where things get a bit complicated.
Okay.
You see, while the intention might have been to, raise a lot of revenue, the reality on the ground was quite different. Instead of boosting government coffers, the 97.5% rate actually ended up having the opposite effect.
Really?
It kind of backfired in a pretty spectacular way.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued.
Yeah.
How could a high tax rate lead to less revenue for the government?
Right.
That doesn't seem to add up.
It might seem counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but it all comes down to human behavior and economic principles.
Okay.
When faced with such a steep tax rate, high-income earners were incredibly motivated to find ways to avoid paying it.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it.
Mm-hmm.
If you were in their shoes, wouldn't you be looking for any loophole or creative accounting trick to keep more of your hard-earned money?
I think I'd at least be tempted.
Right.
But did people really act on that temptation?
Oh, yeah.
Was tax evasion really that widespread?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Remember, this was the 1970s.
Right.
The systems for tracking income and enforcing tax compliance weren't nearly as sophisticated as they are today.
Right.
So people found ways to underreport their earnings,
Mm-hmm.
shelter income in various ways,
Okay.
and essentially operate outside the formal economy to avoid the taxman.
So instead of this massive influx of tax revenue to fund all these great social programs, the government was left with less money than before.
Exactly. Yeah, and this shrinking tax base kind of had a ripple effect throughout the economy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When people have less incentive to earn and invest, it can really stifle economic growth.
Makes sense.
It's a classic example of what economists call the Laffer curve.
The Laffer curve.
Yeah, the idea that there's this, optimal tax rate that maximizes revenue.
Right.
And if you go beyond that point, it actually leads to diminishing returns.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It seems like this policy, despite its good intentions, really missed the mark.
It did.
But I'm curious about the other side of the coin.
Okay.
We've talked about the negative consequences,
Yeah.
but were there any arguments in favor of such a high tax rate at the time?
That's a great question. And it's really important to consider the context of the era.
Right.
The idea of a highly progressive tax system where the wealthy bear a larger share of the burden was actually quite popular in many parts of the world.
Right.
The goal was to reduce income inequality and create a more just society.
Okay.
And there's a valid argument to be made that a high tax rate, at least in theory, could help achieve those goals.
So it's not just about the money, but also about social fairness and creating a more level playing field.
Exactly.
And some might argue that the revenue generated, even if it was less than expected, still went towards important social programs like the Green Revolution,
Yeah.
which had, a transformative impact on India's agricultural sector and helped alleviate poverty.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a good point.
It is.
It's easy to focus on the economic downsides, but we can't forget about the potential social benefits that might have been realized.
Yeah, for sure.
So how long did this 97.5% rate actually last? Did the government eventually realize that it wasn't working as intended?
They did eventually, yeah.
Okay.
By the 1980s, the highest rate had come down to 66%. And by the 1990s, India underwent this major overhaul of its entire tax system, moving towards a more simplified and market-oriented approach.
I'm guessing those reforms were driven by the realization that the old system just wasn't sustainable.
Absolutely.
Okay.
There was a growing consensus that this complex and burdensome tax code was hindering economic growth.
Yeah.
And, with the rise of globalization and increased competition, India really needed to create a more attractive environment for investment and entrepreneurship.
Right.
The 1990s marked a huge turning point,
Okay.
with a shift towards a more balanced approach that aimed to promote economic growth while still addressing, social needs.
It sounds like a pretty dramatic shift.
It was.
And speaking of dramatic shifts, our source from the Times of India draws a fascinating contrast between this era of sky-high taxes and the 2025 budget presented by Finance Minister Nirmalasitharaman.
It really highlights how much India's economic thinking has evolved.
Yeah.
In the 2025 budget, individuals earning up to Rs 12 lakh pay zero income tax.
That's a world away from the 97.5% rate of the 1970s.
I know. Talk about a complete 180.
I mean, that 2025 policy almost feels like a dream come true compared to what people were facing just a few decades ago.
Right.
But it also makes you wonder if the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction. Are we now in danger of neglecting the importance of wealth redistribution and social programs?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And it's a debate that continues to rage even today.
Yeah.
We're seeing this resurgence of discussions around wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, and other tools aimed at reducing inequality.
Right.
But as India's experience with the 97.5% rate shows, finding the right balance is incredibly tricky.
Yeah, it's definitely not as simple as just picking a number and hoping for the best.
No.
There are so many factors to consider, and unintended consequences always seem to lurk around the corner.
Exactly.
So it sounds like it's really crucial to study history and understand the complexities and engage in thoughtful debate.
It is.
There's no magic bullet. And every policy decision comes with trade-offs.
Definitely.
The goal should always be to find the most sustainable and equitable path forward,
Yes.
even if it means constantly adapting and refining our approach.
Absolutely.
It's really fascinating how this one policy from the 1970s continues to shape conversations about taxation and economic equality in India even today.
It does. It really highlights the long-lasting impact of policy decisions.
Yeah.
And the importance of learning from both, successes and failures.
Yeah.
It reminds us that economic policy isn't just some abstract concept. It has real-world consequences that can be felt for generations.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into India's 97.5% tax experiment, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listener walks away with?
I think the biggest lesson here is that there are no easy answers when it comes to balancing social goals with economic realities.
Right.
The 97.5% tax rate, while aimed at creating a more equitable society, ultimately backfired due to a combination of economic principles and human behavior.
Makes sense.
It's a cautionary tale that highlights the importance of careful consideration, nuanced approaches, and a willingness to adapt based on real-world outcomes.
It seems like the key is finding that sweet spot
Yeah.
where you can promote fairness and social welfare without stifling economic growth and individual initiative.
Exactly. And that sweet spot is likely to vary depending on a country's specific context,
Okay.
its economic structure, and its social priorities.
All right.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution,
Yeah,
which is why ongoing debate and critical thinking are so important.
I agree.
We need to constantly evaluate our policies, learn from the past,
Uh-huh.
and be open to new ideas.
And perhaps most importantly, we need to remember that economic policy always impacts people's lives in very real and tangible ways.
Absolutely.
Whether it's a tax rate, a social program, or a trade agreement, these decisions shape the choices people make, the opportunities they have, and ultimately the kind of society we create.
Well said. It's a powerful reminder that economics isn't just about numbers and graphs.
Right.
It's about people and the pursuit of a better future for everyone.
So to our listener out there, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes.
Does India's experiment with the 97.5% tax rate make you rethink your own views on taxation? What lessons do you think other countries can learn from this chapter of economic history?
And perhaps even more broadly, how do you think we can strike that delicate balance between promoting economic growth and ensuring a more just and equitable society?
It is a tough question.
Food for thought as you continue your own deep dive into the complexities of economics and policy.
Thank you for joining us on this fascinating exploration of India's economic history.
It was my pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. Until next time, keep those minds curious and engaged.
So, that was today's episode of my Side Hustle Weekend podcast. For everyone listening, if you're ready to take action on what you learned today, here's where you can find more resources. First, head over to sidehustleweekend.com. I've put together detailed guides, templates, and case studies. And while you are there, don't miss out on my free newsletter, Side Hustle Weekend. If you found value in today's discussion, hit that like button and subscribe to join our Weekend Hustlers community. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our episodes where we break down more side hustle strategies. Check the description below for all the tools and resources we mentioned today. Remember, everyone's journey starts with a single step. Whether you're looking to make an extra $500 a month or build something bigger, start with what you learned today and take action. So, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode where we'll break down another practical way to grow your income.